In the summer of 1630, across the cities of northern Italy, silence began to replace the ordinary rhythms of life. Streets that once carried merchants, laborers, and clergy fell quiet. Doors were sealed. Windows remained shuttered. Entire neighborhoods seemed to pause, not out of choice, but under the weight of something that moved unseen. Within months, the outbreak would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, overwhelming cities that had long stood at the center of European culture, trade, and power. The events that unfolded were not sudden, nor entirely unexpected. Europe had lived with the threat of plague for centuries. Since the mid-14th century, waves of infection had returned periodically, each time exploiting the conditions of crowded cities, trade networks, and limited medical understanding. By the early 17th century, Italian city-states, though politically fragmented, remained deeply interconnected through commerce and war. This interconnectedness, which had once been a source of prosperity, would become a pathway for disease. The outbreak of 1630 is closely tied to the wider context of the 30 Years' War. Troop movements across Central Europe disrupted populations and supply chains, while soldiers often carried more than weapons. In 1629, imperial forces moved into northern Italy during the War of the Mantuan Succession, a conflict entangled within the larger European struggle. Alongside them came disease. Contemporary records suggest that infected soldiers introduced the plague into the region, particularly around Lombardy. The city of Mantua became one of the earliest centers of infection. From there, the disease spread rapidly along established trade and travel routes. By late 1629 and early 1630, it had reached Milan, one of the largest and most significant cities in northern Italy. Milan's dense population and its position as a commercial hub created conditions that allowed the disease to take hold with devastating speed. Authorities in Milan were not unaware of the danger. Initial reports of illness were met with attempts at containment. Individuals suspected of carrying the disease were isolated, and certain areas were placed under restriction. However, early measures were inconsistent and often delayed. Some officials hesitated to acknowledge the severity of the situation, concerned about economic disruption or public panic. This hesitation allowed the disease to spread further before decisive action was taken. By the spring of 1630, the scale of the crisis in Milan had become undeniable. Hospitals and makeshift care centers began to fill beyond capacity. The city established quarantine facilities, known as lazarettos, where the infected and suspected cases were confined. These spaces, intended as a means of control, often became sites where the disease spread further due to overcrowding and limited sanitation. Daily life changed rapidly. Markets closed or operated under heavy restrictions. Religious gatherings, central to social life, were curtailed or moved outdoors in attempts to reduce transmission. Processions, once thought to offer protection through collective prayer, were increasingly seen as potential sources of contagion. The tension between spiritual practices and emerging public health measures reflected a broader uncertainty about how to respond. As the months progressed, mortality rose sharply. Contemporary accounts, while varying in detail, consistently describe a city under strain. Burial systems could not keep pace with the number of deaths. Authorities implemented organized burial efforts, often involving designated workers tasked with transporting the deceased. These measures, though necessary, contributed to the visible reality of the crisis. The impact extended beyond Milan. Cities such as Venice, Verona, and Bologna also faced significant outbreaks. Venice, with its extensive maritime connections, had long experience managing plague through quarantine systems. The Venetian Republic had established some of the earliest organized public health responses in Europe, including isolation islands and strict inspection of incoming ships. Despite these measures, the 1630 outbreak penetrated defenses, leading to widespread illness and loss of life. In Venice, the government responded with a combination of established protocols and emergency measures. Movement within the city was restricted, and officials enforced quarantine regulations with increased rigor. The Venetian Senate also made a vow to construct a church dedicated to Santa Maria della Salute if the city were delivered from the epidemic. This reflected the continued role of religious belief alongside administrative action. Across affected regions, the social fabric of communities was tested. Families were separated as members were taken to quarantine facilities. Economic activity slowed dramatically. Trade routes, once active, became uncertain as cities attempted to limit contact with outsiders. Labor shortages emerged as workers fell ill or died, affecting agriculture, construction, and essential services. Fear and uncertainty shaped behavior. While many responses were grounded in the best available knowledge of the time, others reflected misunderstanding. Some communities sought to identify causes in environmental conditions, such as foul air, consistent with prevailing medical theories. Others turned to social explanations, occasionally leading to suspicion and accusations, though authorities often attempted to manage and suppress unrest to maintain order. Medical understanding in the early 17th century was limited. The dominant framework of humoral theory emphasized balance within the body, and treatments were based on this model. Physicians employed methods such as bloodletting, herbal remedies, and dietary regulation. While some practices may have provided limited relief or comfort, none addressed the underlying cause of the disease, which would not be understood until centuries later. Despite these limitations, certain public health strategies proved more effective. Isolation, quarantine, and movement restrictions, though imperfectly implemented, did slow the spread in some areas. Cities that acted more decisively often experienced different patterns of outbreak compared to those that delayed intervention. The experience contributed to the gradual evolution of organized public health systems in Europe. By late 1630, the intensity of the outbreak began to decline in several regions. The reasons for this decline were not fully understood at the time. It likely resulted from a combination of factors, including the reduction of susceptible populations, seasonal changes, and the cumulative effects of containment measures. However, the end of the outbreak did not immediately restore normal life. The aftermath revealed the depth of the crisis. Population losses were substantial. In Milan alone, estimates suggest that tens of thousands died, representing a significant portion of the city's inhabitants. Across northern Italy, the total number of deaths reached into the hundreds of thousands. These losses altered demographic structures, leaving gaps in families, trades, and institutions. Economic recovery was slow. With reduced labor forces and disrupted trade networks, cities faced challenges in rebuilding. Some sectors adapted over time, while others struggled for decades. The redistribution of property and wealth also reshaped social hierarchies, as inheritances and vacancies created new opportunities for some and lasting hardship for others. Politically, the outbreak reinforced the importance of centralized authority in managing crises. Governments that demonstrated the ability to organize responses, enforce regulations, and maintain stability were better positioned to recover. The experience influenced future approaches to epidemic management, contributing to more structured and proactive systems. Culturally, the plague left a lasting imprint. Artistic and architectural responses emerged, reflecting both mourning and resilience. In Venice, the Church of Santa Maria della Salute was constructed as a fulfillment of the Senate's vow, becoming a prominent symbol of the city's experience during the epidemic. Such projects served as both religious offerings and public statements of recovery. Written accounts from the period provide insight into how individuals and communities understood the events they lived through. Chronicles, official records, and later literary works describe the atmosphere of uncertainty, the efforts to respond, and the visible changes in daily life. While these accounts vary in perspective, they collectively document a moment when established systems were tested by forces beyond immediate control. The 1630 Italian plague also contributed to a broader European understanding of disease management. Though scientific knowledge remained limited, the practical lessons of quarantine, sanitation, and administrative coordination gained greater recognition. Over time, these lessons would inform more systematic approaches to public health, laying groundwork for future developments. It is important to recognize that the people who lived through this period did so without the frameworks that exist today. Their responses were shaped by the knowledge, beliefs, and institutions available to them. Within those constraints, many efforts, whether medical, administrative, or communal, represented attempts to impose order on a situation that often seemed unpredictable. The legacy of the outbreak is not defined solely by the scale of loss, but also by the changes it prompted. Cities adapted their infrastructure, governments refined their authority, and societies reconsidered how to respond to recurring threats. While the plague would not disappear from Europe immediately, each outbreak contributed to a gradual accumulation of experience. By the time the epidemic subsided, northern Italy had undergone a profound transformation. The visible signs of the crisis, empty homes, altered streets, and restructured communities, served as reminders of what had occurred. Yet life resumed, shaped by both continuity and change. The events of 1630 remain a significant chapter in the history of disease and society. They illustrate how interconnected systems can amplify risk, how responses can influence outcomes, and how communities navigate periods of uncertainty. Through recorded history, the outbreak stands as both a warning and a record of resilience, grounded not in dramatic interpretation, but in the enduring reality of what unfolded across those cities.